Okay, good morning. Welcome back. Um, Today we're going to continue on the second lecture of Unit 3. But before we do that, I just want to get some things out for everybody. Few things. Number one, thank you for those that have done the test that was on our announcements in our Brightspace. Second thing, for those of you that are asking or submitting requests to have access to the document, I don't know what you're doing. All you've got to do is make a copy for yourself. So in the top left corner on file, it'll say make a copy. So make a copy for yourself and then just do it and then send it to me. So that's the other thing. Because a few of you have sent requests. I don't know what you're doing, to be quite honest with you. So that's what you do. Just make a copy and then do it and then send it to me. Third thing, you can do the first two quizzes now. By now, you should have done at least the first two. There is no time limit for them. They're always open, and you have an unlimited amount of times to attempt these quizzes. So you could take it right now, get 70% on it, and then take it again, and then get 80. Take it again, and then get 100. So you can take it as many times as you want. Ideally, you should be getting 100% after how many tries it takes. So that is the other thing. I think the third or the whatever number I'm on, I've lost track. The last thing before we start is whenever you email me, use my @Learn account. Some of you have been emailing me on just the CSSD one. Use the @Learn account. It's there for you, and that's the best way to keep track of who's asked what. Okay, so use the @Learn account, the thing that you share stuff with me. Yes, I will respond with the other one, but you should be using the @Learn account. It's easier for me to keep track of those conversations instead of having to go in between both accounts. So that is the few housekeeping rule things that I had to do. So we'll just continue. Today there is going to be a lot of content. We are going to go through lots of different things. So you're just going to really pay attention because we're jumping over so many periods of history, and we're just going to skim the surface. If you find some of this stuff super fascinating, some of it all of it you will go into detail in grade 11 and 12. So just bear with it. This is just a sampler of a few events. But when we're focusing on economic globalization, today we are on student activity 20. So this is page 5 in your workbook. We are going to look at the foundations of contemporary globalization. So how did we get to where we are now? We've got to talk about the last 100 plus years, basically the entire 20th century, so the 1900s. We're going to run through all that today. So be prepared to get a lot of information, but the good thing is that this will be a video, so you can always come back to it when we need to focus on like a test for this unit. So just bear with me. We're going to go through this. So let's start. How did the 20th century world events shape contemporary globalization? That's the question we're going to focus on today. So this first map is this is the world in 1914. So the European empires at their height. You can see in the red, Britain has a huge advantage over other places. But you also see places like China and Russia, the United States, France. So this is the world at the time. So the overriding concern was to expand and protect your empire. So more trade and wealth. So everybody wanted to maintain control over things and just make sure that they were making their country wealthy. And a lot of times it was at the expense of the colonized people. So the peoples of South America, of Africa, of Asia, of the South Pacific, they were on the poor end of the stick, and they were the ones that were being exploited a lot more, taken advantage of. All of this empire building left no room for people to find new land, so they really needed to look at getting at each other. So one of the first events that we're going to talk about is the First World War. So the First World War went from 1914 to 1918. And these are some of the reasons that it happened. So it pitted the major empires against each other. Everybody had started to accumulate wealth and power, and they had to flex their muscle somehow, and it was through war. We have alliances that have sprung up. So if we're looking at this map here, the Triple Alliance is Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And then the Triple Entente is Great Britain, France, and Russia. These are the major powers that are going to go to war from 1914 to 1918. Others are going to join in, but this is the stage is set for war. It does include colonies as well. So Canada was involved in the First World War because of our ties to Britain. Places like Australia, New Zealand, India were also involved because of their connections to Britain. And then same with all the other colonies as well. So the war, it was the war to end all wars. That's what it was called because of the size of it. It encompassed 3 continents, so it was huge. The cost of failure too high in money, deaths, and casualties. It was a war that no European country had ever really fought in on the scale of how the size of the amount of casualties and how much it cost. Because this war, it was known as a total war. So I would just remember that phrase for the future. Total war meant that everybody was involved. All nations pitted all their resources to win. So everything in France, everything in Germany, everything in Russia was focused on the war. All the materials that were being made were focused on war. Food was pushed towards the troops. And that also meant that everybody was fair game to be attacked. You didn't have to be a soldier at the front to die. Because we do see in World War I the use of aerial bombing and artillery to attack cities and to attack industry. So factory workers were seen as just as valuable as the soldiers were. So total war, all of society is now involved in this war. So we start to see this is going to change the layout of the world, and it's going to start to push humanity in a new direction. So 15 million, this is the aftermath. So 15 million soldiers killed among all sides. Everybody had thought that this was going to be a quick victory because wars had in the past not been as long as this one is going to be. Yeah, there was some much longer wars, but in recent memory, towards the end of the 19th century, the wars weren't terribly long. So they expected every power thought they were going to win, but then it turns into what's known as a war of attrition. So it's a long war where essentially instead of not one knockout blow, it's a prolonged struggle. So best way to think about it, if you're not too familiar with military terms, is imagine a boxing match where you have two boxers, and each of them is trying to knock out the other with that one punch that will knock the other person out. However, neither of them can land that killer shot, so what they're doing is they're having to just wrestle with each other and quick jabs, defends, these sort of things. It's a more prolonged thing where they get more fatigue, you're more tired instead of just that one knockout blow. That's what really, and that's why we see 15 million soldiers killed throughout the war. So if you're following along on the slides, slide 7 has an oversimplification of the First World War. I would give it a watch because it's going to go into detail about the events of the First World War. When you get to grade 11, you're going to spend an entire unit on the First World War, so just be patient. If you really find this interesting, you could take a whole course in university on just the First World War. So slide 8 shows you the casualty numbers. So it was staggering. So not only was there physical casualties of human beings lost, but we're also talking about the economic costs of the war. Large portions of Europe were destroyed. So northern France, which saw majority of the battles of the Western Front, was destroyed because of the new technology that was being used. Artillery, so really large cannons, were firing massive shells that destroyed landscape, the trees, farmland, destroyed completely. Western Russia was also destroyed because of the battling done there between the Russians and the Germans and the Austrians. Another thing we have to understand is when we talk about economic costs of the war is how much it actually cost. So all the Allied Europeans, so Britain, France, and Russia, they were forced to borrow money to keep the war going. And it largely came from the United States because up until 1917, the United States was not in the war, but they were really benefiting from providing resources to Britain, to France, and to Russia. So we do see them going into debt because of having to borrow money. So whenever country is at war with each other and everything is fair game now with total war, international trade was brought to a standstill. And manufacturing in Europe dropped a lot because they're not making things that ordinary people can use. They're not making chairs, they're not making tea kettles, they're making bullets and they're making guns for the soldiers to fight. And because a lot of places, their colonies, they couldn't bring in a lot of material sometimes, it affected the economy as well. Because the British had put a blockade, basically with boats, they had stopped any boats going in, so places like Germany couldn't bring in stuff from their colonies. Germany had what was known as U-boats, which is German for Unterseeboot, which is basically a submarine, and they were shooting down anything that was in the water, both military and even some civilian carriers. One of them actually is what brought the United States into war because it killed, I think, 200 and something U.S. citizens. But what was actually interesting is that boat, I've forgotten the name of it. I'll try to remember while the video is playing. It had civilians, but underneath it had military supplies too. So it was a secret little trade going on with the United States and England. So both sides were not able to get a full benefit from their empire. So European manufacturing dropped drastically. So that does affect the war. So slide 11 is the part 2 of the oversimplified World War I. You're probably in this one here, you're going to see the entry of the United States and the exit of Russia and then the peace. So peace is signed in 1919 at the Treaty of Versailles. The peace treaty was supposed to correct all the world's problems. They just went through 4 years of war and they saw millions of casualties. not only we're talking casualties that physically died, but thousands, maybe even millions. Oh no, scratch that. Not maybe, definitely millions of people who were wounded both physically and psychologically. Because World War One is where we're introduced to this idea of shell shock, what we now call PTSD. So the mental fatigue and breakdown of soldiers who experienced 4 years in combat. One thing that I feel that we often overlook is the mental state of being in war. Yes, at any second, it could all be over. But imagine living in that prolonged sense of, okay, is the next moment when I die? Or if I stand over here, am I going to die? If I stand over there, am I going to die? This sort of stress shattered some men, and you can see when they return home that people weren't even prepared to cope with this. Doctors had no idea how to treat these people, and unfortunately, sometimes the way they were treated was as if they had been cowards trying to get out of the war by faking an illness of the mind. So it is a very serious thing, the mental health of the soldiers. So the man pictured here, President Woodrow Wilson, he came up with this idea of peace, and it's called his 14 points. He brought that to the table in France as a way to try to make peace between the Europeans. So the idea of self-determination was one of those points. So self-determination, we talked about it in class once or twice. So all ethnic groups should determine their own fate. So he is really saying that these empires that have so many different ethnicities, maybe they need to make way for more countries to come up of specific ethnic peoples. That would bring a more stable. Europe. So countries under imperial control demanded separation. Canada had her own representatives at the peace signing. So Canada really exists as a country because of what it did during the First World War, and it started to gain more independence from Britain. And then by the time World War II comes around, we are actually able to decide when we go to war. So we really gained a lot of independence between World War I and World War II. And then this other idea of repatriation. So money paid by the defeated powers, such as Germany, to the victors. That was one of the really specific points that the people of France wanted, especially. They wanted compensation because their country had been the one that suffered the most damage, and they wanted to be paid. They wanted to have things paid by the losers. And Germany is the one that really gets stuck with the bill, and we'll see why. So, Germany is essentially given all the punishment. So they lose territory in Europe, and some areas are actually occupied by the Allies, so the British and the French. And they also lose their empire. So places that they had taken over in Africa were given to different peoples. So the Belgians were given Rwanda. That's where when we talked about Rwanda. And then Japan was given areas in the South Pacific, and then Britain was given the rest of the African colonies. The reason that Germany was stuck with the bill is because Italy has switched sides, and it kind of skipped out on the punishment because in 1915 they switched sides and they benefited from a treaty signed with the British to give them territory. And Austria-Hungary couldn't be given the blame because Austria-Hungary doesn't exist anymore. So if you're following along slide 14, this is what the European map looked like afterwards. Austria-Hungary is gone. It is no longer a country. Same goes with the Ottoman Empire, so modern-day Turkey. That also joined with Germany and Austria to fight. However, it is also no longer a country as well. The modern state of Turkey is born, and then its colonies in the Middle East are divided between the English and the French. So the entire map of Europe has been shaken. So this is Europe, and we talked about the colonies being changed. Um, the effects of the war on Canada. Canada suffered 66,000 deaths and many more wounded during the war. Canada had a population of 8 million people. So that amount of people coming back wounded or dead did play a significant impact on the population. It was very expensive, so a temporary tax method was introduced to fund the war. This is the income tax. It's not temporary because it's still around. But one positive note from all this death and destruction is the social transformation. So we see that women, they stepped into the role of worker while the men went off to fight in Europe. When the men came back, the women were like, you know, what we were doing helped this country, so we want better representation, and they demanded it. So what we will see is that things like the right to vote for women is actually granted following the First World War. If you go downtown, I forget where this is, but there's a statue of 5 women. These 5 women actually played a pivotal role in gaining the vote for women. But let's jump back over into Europe because we did not address one thing. If you go back to slide 14, you're going to see Russia. It has a fancy new name. It's called the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic. It's not the empire anymore. So in 1914, the Russian Empire ruled 150 million people from 100 different ethnic backgrounds. So it would have been known as a multinational empire. Same with Austria and same with the Ottoman Empire. All 3 of those actually don't exist anymore. The economy of Russia was really slow. It was really backwards. The train system was not as developed. The industry was not as developed. They had a few cities that were focused on industries, on industrialized things like factories, but the majority of people were still living on farms, and it was very rural. They had a very massive population, but a lot of it were either poor or farmers. There wasn't a whole lot of factory workers. So when it came to total war, they couldn't handle it. So there was a lot of things like famines. A lot of their soldiers were not well equipped to fight the war as well. So there was a huge number of dead during the war. So we're talking 4 million people. That's huge, just for one country to sustain. So Tsar Nicholas II, the man with his hands on his shoulders in this photo or drawing, he's overthrown by a revolution led by the communists. Civil war lasts until 1922, and then the communists secure power. And this is where the Soviet Union is born. So the idea of communism is an economic and political model which removes the capitalist class. So the class that had control over the industries, it is eliminated, and it is all state-owned. So the government controls everything. It's opposed by the capitalist systems in Western Europe and North America because it's a threat to their way of life. The way that they see the Soviet Union is as as a threat to the way that their countries are run. So the Communist Party, it rules Russia, and it's the only party that exists. It becomes what's known as a one-party state. So if you're following along, slide 19, this is the Soviet Union. So the USSR, the United Soviet, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So it encompasses modern day Russia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Belarus, the Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and then they'll take Mongolia as well, and obviously Russia. So it is the largest country to ever exist as a whole. Um, its leadership, it begins with a man by the name of Vladimir Lenin, but in 1924 Vladimir Lenin dies, and then it's a battle between two individuals, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin secures power in 1929 and rules as an absolute dictator. He sees Russia as backwards, as falling behind the other European countries. He's even saying we're as far behind as 100 years. So he says, I am going to modernize Russia or the USSR. He has this idea for a 5-year plan, and he's going to create an industrial powerhouse in those 5 years. And he is going to drag Russia along and industrialize it. One of the ways he does this is this idea of collectivization. So he creates these large state-owned farms which are worked communally. So instead of having farmers running their own things, all the farmland is put together in this massive farm, and the farmers are given their jobs on this farm to produce things. Obviously, a lot of people are not too thrilled, and a lot of people resist. But Stalin is not going to back down. He is going to make Russia, the Soviet Union, into an economic powerhouse. So he is going to industrialize. So hundreds of thousands are forced from their farms to work in the new factories in the cities. So we're talking, when we talked about the Industrial Revolution in England in the 1850s, 17 to 1850s, people were willingly going to the cities because of agriculture being more focused on larger farms and technology. What we're seeing in Russia is more at gunpoint. You're going to go to the city, you're going to work in the factory. This was an extensive process, and Stalin needed capital to build factories and infrastructure. So what he's actually going to do is he's going to sell grain to other countries for money to build more industry. Here, I'll just give you this, and you'll learn more about this next year and the year after, is that the 5-year plan is actually a success, and Joseph Stalin is able to bring Russia within 5 years to on par with the rest of Europe. At the same time, though, he does cause one of the most horrific famines that human history has ever seen in the Ukraine. It's called the Great Famine. It's called the Holodomor. Not very many people are aware of it, but it actually kills 6 million Ukrainians in the process. So Stalin really pushes the limit to how much people can sustain, all for this industrialization. And we see that Russia, even after the Soviet Union and during the Second World War, will become a superpower because of what it does in the 1920s and 1930s. And we see it now, the effects as well, when we look at the modern state of Russia. In China, following the Second World War, it's going to do the exact same thing. It's going to have a revolution, and it's going to do this industrialization fairly quickly, the same way that the Soviets did it as well. And we see China now living in that post industrialized way, and that's why it is also one of the economic powerhouses that exists. Also, though, I do not want to undercredit the fact that, like the Soviets, millions of people die along the way. If you're curious about that, I can give you some more resources to help you understand that. But that's not what we're talking about here, so let's move on. We're going to talk about what happens outside of Russia now. Following the First World War, things are good. The 1920s in the West are rapid economic growth. They're known as the Roaring Twenties, especially in the United States, because the United States comes out of the First World War pretty well off. They've supplied tools, they've supplied weapons, ammunition, loans to the Europeans. They're pretty well off. So the 20s are seen as this time a good time. Um, so socially, things have changed. Women have more social independence. Things are great. But as you can see by the title, the Great Depression is going to start towards the end of the 1920s, and it's going to last until 1939. So we're going to have 10 years of hardship coming up. Tuesday, October the 29th, the New York stock market goes down. It causes a panic, like with any sort of stock market situation. People start to panic and they start to sell their stocks, driving the prices down, 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 and this leads to the market actually crashing. So this starts a chain reaction around the world. We call this market crash the Great Depression. So if you're following along on slide 24, we can see in October, we can see the market is slowly gearing, it's crashing down. And with everybody selling, businesses start to lay off workers, people are losing their jobs, and everyone is starting to worry. Other countries are starting to worry about their own industries. So governments across the world implement tariffs, so taxes, in an attempt to encourage national industries. So they put taxes on their borders, essentially saying, if you're bringing something in, I'm going to tax you on it to discourage you from doing it, so we'll buy it more locally. International trade dries up because of this. Nobody wants to trade with anybody because it costs too much money. So we're going to see businesses fail. The value of money drops substantially. People will have millions in the bank one day and then be dirt poor the next day. It is extremely sad and extremely alarming. So the depression in Canada was not immune to this as well. Unemployment rose to 26.6%. So that meant that for every 4 Canadians, one of them was without a job. And exports fell by 50%. So if your business was to supply countries outside the world, if you were selling things outside of Canada, your exports fell by 50%. So you lost half your business. We also see the price of grain is falling. And then we also see a severe drought, which we can't really control, but it happens. So the entire world kind of falls into this depression where money has lost its value. An excellent example is when we look at Germany, which is suffering tremendously because not only is their economy crashed, but also they're supposed to be paying back their debts to the European powers. We see there's pictures of German kids playing with stacks. I'm talking stacks of German marks, their money, and they're using them as building blocks because they're essentially worthless. We see people going. There's pictures of people going with wheelbarrows full of money, like hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars or marks to go buy a loaf of bread. So like a loaf of bread would have cost 6 million marks or 6 billion marks. The value of money is disappeared. So in the Depression in Europe, it allows these extreme ideas to come up. So in Italy, we see the rise of Benito Mussolini, and then in Germany, we see the rise of Adolf Hitler. Mussolini, he sees Italy broken, and he attempts to fix it. He takes Italy and will transform it into a fascist state, again, a one-party state, but he focuses on making Italy a stronger country. Hitler does the same thing too, but he focuses more on the First World War and says that Germany was treated badly. The peace treaty, it was meant to destroy Germany, and then he'll say that Germany didn't lose the war because the point he'll make is true, that no Allied soldier actually invaded Germany, but that the Germans, he believes, were stabbed at the back from the inside, and he focuses attention on the Jewish people of Germany as being the reason why they lost the war. So Hitler convinced that the disillusioned people of Germany were there to control the world as the master race. So he will start to talk about how he has dreams for making Germany great. He wants to shift the economy. He wants to bring pride back to the people because of the First World War and the humiliation that they felt. And he does things that go against the treaty. So he expands Germany's borders. He goes west into the Rhineland, which had been occupied by the Allies. So he brings an army there. Nothing happens. So he's starting to gain confidence. He goes then to Austria and Czechoslovakia and takes land there. He actually will take all of Austria and make it a part of Germany, and then takes parts of Czechoslovakia first, and then takes the rest. Again, no response by the Europeans. There was a conference that was held between Italy, France, Germany, and England, where they agree that Hitler and Germany can have parts of Czechoslovakia, because they are following this policy of appeasement. They're trying to give in because they don't want to fight a war. They had seen 4 years of war. They'd seen 15 million people dead. They had seen the effects of this war. They were not looking forward to having another war. So let's fast forward to 1939, September 1st. Germany invades Poland, which then therefore means that Britain must declare war. And then 9 days later, Canada declares war on September 10th. It shows you that we have a little bit more independence now. And World War I will begin. So on slide 30, here's an oversimplified video of World War II. It's going to go through everything that happened in a very simplified way, so 9 minutes. This World War, more than 50 countries are involved, and there is an estimated range of 60 to 75 million dead. And this is civilian and military. So this chart here shows you military casualties, civilian casualties. The Soviet Union actually has one of the largest, because from 1941 to 1943, the fight between Germany and the Soviets is bloody, and we see some of the worst fighting during the war. So the Battle of Leningrad was extremely difficult. The Battle of Stalingrad, these two battles, millions are dying. So that's why the Soviet Union has the most, because we're talking civilian deaths too. A lot of other things are going on underneath as well, like ethnic cleansing, the Holocaust and all that stuff. So that does play a big part as well. The map on slide 32, this is German-controlled Europe. So anything that is in a either dark brown or a light brown, besides England essentially and the Soviet Union, that is occupied by the Nazis. Switzerland, Spain, Sweden, they're neutral. They don't get involved, but everything else has been occupied by 1942. So you can see the map, how far the line, that yellow line, that's the farthest that they actually went into the Soviet Union. So they fought at Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad's not on the map though, but it shows you that they expanded quite a lot. So World War II, we see the world change again. So 45,000 Canadians died and 54,000 are wounded. It's a more balanced war. Canada built an army, air force, and navy, and developed new industries. So automotive, aero, and ship building. So Canada really starts to get into the war, and it starts to build itself as a stronger industrialized nation. The war ends the Depression because money is flowing, people are buying things, the government is buying weaponry, people are going to war to make tanks, to make planes, to make ships, to make bullets, ammunition, anything that was used in the war. The war essentially saved the economy. Yes, it kills 75 million people, but it brought people out of the Depression. And Canada does its part as well, because when the war began in 1939, between 1939 and 1940, Germany knocks France out of the war. So it's really just England and Canada against Germany, and a lot of a lot of planes and training was actually done in Canada for the Royal Air Force. The land that Mount Royal University is built on was actually an airfield during the Second World War. So we played our part a lot. So slide 34 is an oversimplified version or video of the Second World War. So this is probably the end of the war that you're going to see here. So the war is going to end, and again, the world is shattered more so than it was during the First World War because of the extent of fighting. So all of Europe has been destroyed. North Africa, the Middle East, Asia, everywhere has almost every part of the world, every continent has been touched by the war. So in 1944, 44 island countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the United States, and they were trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do once this war is over? Because we don't want what happened before to happen again. Because World War One ended, things were great, then things turned sour, and we got the Great Depression. So they were trying to figure out, okay, what can we do to make sure that it does not? So what they decide is they establish a system of rules, institutions, and procedures for the post-war global economy. It's called the Bretton Woods Agreement. It effectively establishes a new international monetary system to promote international trade. So essentially what they're going to do is they're going to regulate currency and money among Western countries. They're going to make sure that the value of money stays constant. Because what they saw in the Great Depression was the value of money went up and then it crashed. So they're going to tie a value to the money, and it's going to be pegged to a gold standard. So after the Bretton Woods Agreement, it led to the creation of many international organizations. So the World Bank is formed, which still exists today. The International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, also created in there. And these are organizations that really are just running the world economy. Today we can see the World Bank and the IMF trying its best to promote development in the world. Now it's trying to prevent an economic crash. And then we also see the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which later becomes the World Trade Organization. So they're going to try their best to make sure that what happened in the Great Depression doesn't happen again. But we're going to see what the world looks like afterwards. So on the last slide here, you're going to see how America became a superpower. So following World War II, there's only really two superpowers left, because all of Europe has destroyed itself. The United States and the Soviet Union, these are the two countries that come out of the war with more territory, and their economies are really hungry. The United States is on a war economy. It's been producing a lot. It's rich. The Soviet Union has conquered half of Europe and has decided to keep it. They've set up these new countries with free elections. Really, they've just created these communist states that is going to create this whole lovely next 50 years called the Cold War, which we will probably bring up in the video tomorrow. But that's it for today. I've spent a long time going through a lot of information, so if you have to break this video up, please do so. If you have any questions, please comment them or email them to me. Some of you have been doing a great job of doing that, and I thank you for your efforts during this crazy time. I wish we could have been in class today to do this sort of lecture, because this is stuff that I love. What we went through today is what I am super passionate about, and more than half of these books are related to this period that we just finished talking about. So I'll leave it there for today. Stay safe. That goes for you and your families. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Like I said, I'll never see you. I'll just hope that you see me. So, bye.